Welcome to session 3 of Bach's St. Matthew Passion here at Christ Episcopal Church. It's good to have you back. First off, my name's Bill Duxbury, but I want to thank you for all of those who have watched through the first 2 sessions. I have to be honest, it's a little weird sitting at my desk and recording these while staring at my computer screen, although having my dog Jammer as company has been nice. Oh, and for those of you who wonder occasionally when you hear a bell going off, I have a old school Navy ship's clock that goes off every half hour on the Navy system of telling time, which if you ever want to know, you can ask me or Mike Dickens. I'm still learning where the camera is at while I do this, along with how to edit everything together. So please, 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 trust me. I'm better at my normal job as an airline captain than as a video producer. If you're jumping into this session at session 3, I highly recommend you go back and watch session 1 and 2 first, because we're going to be having stuff that we're going to talk about that I've already presumed that you've seen those first 2 sessions. You will also need, if you haven't already downloaded it, the handout which goes along with this. This includes the German and English translations. The original Bach St. Matthew Passion was all written in German, and I've given you an English translation. And it also has notes and various things to listen to on your own time as you go through this. This week, we're going to keep our lecture portion shorter than normal so that we can enjoy more great music as we go through it. And I'm trying to keep each of these sessions to about 50 minutes or so. As part of our lecture, we're going to discuss some necessary musical terms, some musical theory, all of that stuff. Don't worry, this isn't going to be difficult, but let's go ahead and dive right in. First off, let's talk about some musical terms. I've probably been promiscuous with throwing some of these terms out, so let me explain some of them to you. The first term would be polyphonic. This literally means multiple melodies. Up until the end of the Baroque period, and we define the Baroque period as going from 1600 to the death of Johann Sebastian Bach in 1750, most of the vocal and later instrumental music was made up of multiple melodies that were all intertwined with each other. The musical styles were fugue, canon, passacaglia, and others. To our ears, polyphonic music is oftentimes hard to listen to because there's multiple melodies all going on at once, but for the folks in the Baroque period, that would have been much more normal. The other musical term is homophonic, and literally this is a single melody. Starting in the late Baroque period and moving forward, music was much more composed for a single melody. We get into what we call the classical period of music, starting with, say, Haydn and Mozart and into Beethoven. Most of the melodies had one single melody. Now, we're used to that in our ears, just listening to one melody at a time. That's much more normal for us. The other thing that you're going to hear, particularly today, is what might be called a canon. Probably the most familiar canon that we would hear from the Baroque era that's ubiquitous at all weddings would be Pachelbel's canon. All right? A canon is a melody that repeats itself over and over and over. It's not exactly like a round as in row, row, row your boat gently down the stream, but it does have some similarities to that in that the melody does not change throughout the various variations of it. A canon is not, there's some major similarities to it, and the next thing we're going to discuss, but that would be a canon. Related to a canon in some ways would be what we call a fugue. A fugue is much more complicated than a canon. A fugue is where a fugue will always have a musical subject that it starts off with, and it'll be presented first in one voice, and then presented again in another voice, and then another, and oftentimes a fourth voice. And typically, when we say voices, we mean it might be presented in an instrument that's playing high in the musical scale, and then presented by one that's playing, a little lower in the musical scale, and then a little lower, and then a little lower. That's what we mean by voices. We don't always mean literally voices, but sometimes we do. Each time, though, that the subject is presented, the fugue is going to change just a little bit differently on how it's presented, how the harmonization is done, everything like that. You might want to think of a fugue would be, we would sing, row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. And then we'd sing that together as a canon. Think of a fugue as you'd sing the row, row, row your boat. And then when you get to life is but a dream, well, one voice might go into a totally different melody. It might go into the Everly Brothers song, dream, 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 dream. Or another voice might go into life is but a, I'm dreaming of a white Christmas. And the third voice might go, life is but a dream on, dream on, dream until your dreams come true. So that's how a fugue might be. Fugues are very complicated, and in the Baroque period, there was literally thousands and thousands of fugues that were composed. Bach was the master of the fugue. So those are some of the musical styles, musical types that we're going to hear throughout here. Now we need to get into some music theory. And for this, I'm going to break out my trusty guitar. All right? The first thing is, on most Western music, we have a tonic note or chord in a musical scale. Okay? So if we have the key of C, the first note is going to start on the key of C. And then the scale might go C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Okay, so that would be the tonic, would be C. All right, the dominant is always the fifth note of the scale. And trust me, I'm going to get to why we need to know this. Okay, so if we were doing the C scale, the fifth note would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It would be a G note. And then related to that also is what we would call a subdominant. Sorry, my screensaver just kicked in and I lost my notes. Would be the subdominant. And this is always the fourth note of the scale. So for C, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, which would be an F note. Now this, musically, is used quite frequently, particularly in Western music, where the major chords, the major tonal structure is based on the tonic, which is the root note, the dominant, which is the fifth note, and the subdominant, which is the fourth note. So when you play songs, you might hear something like, and that's all based on the various notes of that tonic, dominant, and subdominant notes. Now, why I bring this up is because our musical ears that we listen to always want, or we desire, music to return back to the tonic note. We call that a closed cadence in musical terms. So we might do something like this. that sounds normal. We resolved it back to the tonic root of the whole thing. Now, if we leave the music unresolved as we go through it, this leaves us feeling like something isn't exactly right. Okay? So let's listen to this here and tell me if this does not quite feel right when I play it. When I stop there, everybody leans forward a little bit and they're like, I want it to go back to, because then it's resolved, okay? Now the reason I point this out is Bach, throughout the St. Matthew Passion, is going to use this resolved and unresolved multiple times. At times he's going to use it to say, this is finished. And it gives us a sense that, okay, all is right. And then there's going to be times where he very purposefully leaves things unresolved musically that then leaves us just hanging. And unless I point them out, you may not even notice it. Okay, so what I'm going to do as we move forward is I'm going to point out some times where Bach does this musical, I don't want to call it trickery because it's not. It's just great compositional skills that he's used. So let's delve back into the music. We're going to pick up on number 22 in your scores. So if you want to take a moment to find those, just as a way of refresher, when we last finished up session 2 on number 21, we had introduced for the first time what's known as the Passion Chorale, what we would call O Sacred Head, Once Wounded. And we talked a lot about the origins of this and how it's been used throughout time. When we get to number 22 here, we get to the whole interaction between Peter and Jesus. We get to Peter's bold proclamation that he will not deny Jesus, that he will be true. And you notice that in this thing, musically, when you listen to it, on number 22, that the second time that Peter proclaims he will not deny Jesus, Bach has moved this music up a whole step in the key signatures, emphasizing Peter's determination that he will stand true, which of course we know will come crashing down around him. Almost right away on number 23, Bach returns to the Passion Chorale that he just introduced us to. This time, the chorus is acting not only as the disciples, but they're acting as all of God's people. Bach uses the exact same harmonization as in number 21, but he has dropped it down to a lower key, which gives it a more solemn feel. And I want you to notice when you listen to it that the chorus sings the first 4 lines of this forte, which means strong. All right, literally forte is strong, like a fort. They sing it as if with conviction of, I will never leave you. But Bach, knowing the human condition, has the chorus sing quietly at the end of the chorale, knowing that in the end, we will all be like Peter and we will deny and walk away from Jesus. The allusion in the last line is, for me, is hard to miss to Michelangelo's Pieta in St. Peter's Basilica. This is the famous work, if you've ever been to St. Peter's there in the Vatican, of a very young Mary holding in her arms and lap Jesus after he'd been taken down from the cross dead. So let's take a listen to this together, shall we?
Petrus aber antwortete und sprach zu ihm:
Wenn sie auch alle sich an dir ärgerten, so will ich doch mich nimmer mehr ärgern.
Jesus sprach zu ihm:
Wahrlich, ich sage dir, in dieser Nacht, ehe der Hahn kräht, wirst du nicht dreimal verleugnen.
Petrus sprach zu ihm:
Und wenn ich mit dir sterben müsste, so will ich dich nicht verleugnen.
Desgleichen sagten auch alle Jünger.
We now move to musical numbers 24, 25, and 26. We move out of the upper room where the Last Supper is had into the Garden of Gethsemane. And I want you to notice in number 24, in the recitative, that slowly as we move through this work, this dispassionate evangelist becomes more and more a thing of the past. More and more the evangelist starts to get involved in the story. They're no longer just the reporter reporting the facts, but they start to invest themselves in the story. And here's one of the musical things I want you to notice. When the evangelist in number 24 sings, "Began to grieve and despair," note how his vocals are filled with a descending drama of notes as he sings that. In 25, Bach continues to use soloists, in this case a tenor, in dialogue with the chorus. We've heard this before. Here the tenor is boldly stating Jesus' pain, torment, and suffering, while the chorus returns, singing from a chorale first introduced as number 3, to draw the listeners back in. In this case, the chorus is singing a quiet confession, responding with the more personal, "It is my sins that have struck you down." Bach once again is bringing us back to one of the themes that he has here, that he's wanting to teach the theology of Jesus' suffering. The chorus reminds us of it by reacting as we all would. It is my sins. It is my sins that have struck you down. This reinforces one of Bach's universal themes. Jesus suffers for the sake of our sins. The illusion of he suffers all the torments of hell takes us directly to the Apostles' Creed, which at the time was translated, "He descended to hell." Today we make it more palatable to say he descended to the dead, because we don't like to talk about hell nowadays. In number 26, as you've probably already noted, Bach likes to pair up instruments with the vocal areas. Here he brings in the oboe. If you're not familiar with the oboe, it's scored in the same vocal range as the tenor. So it acts kind of, in this case, as a cry of a night watchman, let's keep watch over the gate of the city. And for anybody who's been to a city such as Jerusalem or Old London or the various English towns there that had gates, you understand the importance of a watchman over the gate of a city. The tenor's words bring us back to a major tenet of Bach's Lutheran Reformation faith. Stay with Jesus, profess him, Jesus forgives our sins. And we see this all throughout this tenor aria. Notice how each time the tenor sings, I meant to keep watch with Jesus, he sings with less and less conviction, as if he knows that I mean to do this, but I'm not going to do it. This is much like we might experience at the beginning of Lent. At the beginning of Lent, we are convinced we are going to keep a holy Lent. We are going to give up and fill in the blank. Of course, this year we're all going to keep our social distancing. But as the days move forward, we, just as the tenor here in Bach's St. Matthew Passion, start to weaken. And we start to follow through as the tenor, and we sing or we act with less and less conviction. The chorus here, in responding to the tenor's words, starts out as a hushed prayer of hope. If we do keep watch, our sins will fall asleep, never to be seen again. In sort of contrast with the tenor, the people of God, through the chorus, move to a bolder and bolder proclamation of faith, as if willing that this could happen by their own self-efforts, which Bach immediately returns to the more hesitant singing of the beginning of the aria, proclaiming now more of a question. I mean to keep watch with Jesus? I'm not sure I really do. With the chorus echoing again this same phrase. But Bach's implications are clear. We will fall asleep. We will be sinful. We never are without the need of the cross of Good Friday.
Da kam Jesus mit ihnen zu einem Hofe, der hieß Gethsemane, und sprach zu seinen Jüngern:
Setzet euch hin, bis dass ich dorthin gehe und bete.
Und nahm zu sich Petrus und die 2 Söhne Zebedei und fing an zu trauern und zu zagen. Da sprach Jesus zu ihnen:
Meine Seele ist betrübt bis an den Tod. Bleibet hier und wachet mit mir.
O Schmerz, erzittert das gequälte Herz. Wie sinkt es hin, wie bleicht sein Angesicht. Was ist die Ursache alles solcher Klage? Der Richter führt ihn vor Gericht. Da ist kein Trost, kein Helfer nicht.
So now in musical numbers 27, 28, and 29, we move deep into Jesus' agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. And musically, Bach does a wonderful job with this. I want you to note a couple of things. In number 27, at the end of Jesus' recitative, he ends on an unresolved dominant note, leaving his question unanswered of, if this cup should pass me by, would you please let it? Okay? I mean, literally in the German, okay, it is the Doch nicht wen ich will, sondern wie du wilt. Not as I want it to, but as you want it to, might be how we would express it in our modern way of speaking. Unresolved, and Bach leaves that musical note hanging there, just as I mentioned on trying to do resolved music. He leaves us unanswered with that. In number 28, we come to our first bass aria. Now remember, the bass is almost always going to return us to the foundation of our faith. They are always going to bring us back to what is truly important. And here we see there is no ambiguity about what the Good Friday message is when he sings about it. Our sins, and he says in German, hablich stinken, which is a stinkening stench, is the best way to translate it into English. Our sins are a stinkening stench that has been poured into a cup that Jesus will gladly drink to restore us to God's grace. This is all part of Bach's Reformation faith. A couple other things I want you to notice in number 28, that as the orchestra is playing falling scales representing Jesus prostrate on the ground, well, there's one major exception though. That's when the soloist sings, restoring us to God's grace. And here, the scales move upward, as if going to heaven.
Und ging hin ein wenig, fiel nieder auf sein Angesicht und betete und sprach:
Mein Vater, ist möglich, so gehe dieser Kelch von mir. Doch nicht wie ich will, sondern wie du willst. Der Heiland fällt vor seinem Vater nieder. Dadurch erhebt mich und alle von unserem Falle hinauf zu Gottes Gnade wieder. Er ist bereit, den Kelch des Todes Bitterkeit zu trinken, in welchen Sünden diese Welt gegossen sind und hässlich stinken, weil es dem lieben Gott gefällt. Gerne will ich mich bequemen, Kreuz und Heiland nach, Kreuz und Becher anzunehmen, will ich gerne mich bequemen, trink ich doch dem Heiland nach. Denn sein Mund, der mit Milch und Honig fließet, hat den Grund des Leidens herbe Schmach durch den ersten Trunk versüßet. Denn sein Mund, der mit Milch und Honig fließet, hat den Grund des Leidens herbe Schmach durch den ersten Trunk versüßet. Zu nehmen, trink ich doch dem Heiland nach. Gerne will ich mich bequemen, gerne, gerne will ich mich bequemen, Kreuz und Becher anzunehmen, trink ich doch dem Heiland nach, trink ich doch dem Heiland nach, Kreuz und Becher anzunehmen, will ich gerne mich bequemen, trink ich doch dem Heiland nach.
In musical numbers 30 and 31, we have Jesus' second appeal to God that maybe this cup might pass by him. Notice that Bach uses the exact same melody as the first appeal, but he's moved it up a half step higher. This gives the prayer a greater sense of urgency in the musical notation of it. As before, Jesus ends this plea on an unresolved note, not going down to the tonic, but leaving it unresolved, as if his question is not sure what the answer is. And then in 30, Bach brilliantly inserts the chorale, "What my God wills is always best." Bach uses this to once again draw in the listeners, to remind them that we too, like Jesus, may well pray for this cup to pass, but that in the end we have to trust that God's will is best. Musically, listen for the wavering, angular, chromatic melody on each of the phrases, but each of the phrases ends solidly back on the tonic note. It goes back to the foundation at the end. This gives us a musical sense that yes, we too will waver, but in the end, God will be solid. The chorale melody was written by Claude de Smirsky. He was 1490 to 1562. He mostly studied under the famous Josquin de Paris, who composed many, many Renaissance masses. The text comes from Albrecht von Prussen. He based the words on a meditation of Martin Luther on the Lord's Prayer and set it to this melody here. So let's take a listen to this.
Und kam zu seinen Jüngern und fand sie schlafend und sprach zu ihnen:
Könnet ihr denn nicht eine Stunde mit mir wachen? Wachet und betet, dass ihr nicht in Anfechtung fallet. Der Geist ist willig, aber das Fleisch ist schwach.
Zum andermal ging er hin, betete und sprach:
Mein Vater, ist nicht möglich, dass dieser Kelch von mir gehe. Ich trinke ihn denn, so geschehe dein Wille.
In number 32, we have the third time that Jesus prays. And this time, and actually in the Gospel of St. Matthew, you find that it's only recounted by the narrator, but not by Jesus. Almost as if it's too painful to hear Jesus speak those words again. And this time, as it is sung, notice that it squarely ends on the tonic chord. All right, the very foundation chord of this, leaving no doubt what the answer is, that this cup will not pass. We then move into the actual betrayal of Jesus, and note the sense of anger that Jesus has when addressing his disciples, but almost a tenderness when he's singing to Judas. And then immediately after the arrest, the evangelist becomes much more agitated and will remain so all the way to the end of part 1. He is no longer the dispassionate observer of everything. He is now fully engaged in the story.
Und kam und fand sie aber schlafend, und ihre Augen waren voll Schlafs. Und ließ sie und ging abermal hin und betete zum 3. Mal und redete dieselbigen Worte. Da kam zu seinen Jüngern und sprach zu ihnen:
Ach, wollt ihr nun schlafen und ruhen? Siehe, die Stunde ist hier, dass des Menschen Sohn in der Sünder Hände überantwortet wird. Steht auf, lasset uns gehen. Siehe, ist da, der mich verrät.
Und als ihr noch redete, siehe, da kam Judas, der 12 einer, und mit ihm eine große Schar, mit Schwerten und mit Stangen, von den hohen Priestern und Ältesten des Volks. Und der Verräter hatte ihnen ein Zeichen gegeben und gesagt: Welchen ich küssen werde, der ist's, den greifet. Und alsbald trat er zu Jesu und sprach:
Gegrüßet seist du, Rabbi.
Und küssete ihn. sprach zu ihm:
Mein Freund, warum bist du kommen?
Da traten sie hinzu und legten die Hände an Jesu und griffen ihn.
So in 33 and number 34, Bach depicts the disciples' reaction to Jesus' arrest in three ways, oftentimes, I guess, mirroring our contemporary psychology of what we do under stress: fight, flight, or freeze. In this case, Bach chooses the order of freeze, fight, and then flight. In 33, notice we have a beautiful duet between the soprano and the alto. This has them frozen. They're unable to believe that Jesus is gone. They wonder if the sun and the moon will ever rise again. And to accentuate how the bottom has fallen out, Bach even removes the ever-present continuo as they sing. Interspersed with this, the chorus slowly gets angrier and angrier with cries of "Leave him! Stop! Do not bind him!" The German is wonderful in here. In the final notes of this duet, if they sound vaguely familiar to you rockers, well, this is the exact same harmony that Duane Allman and Dickie Betts used many times in their guitar work, such things as Jessica, and it's also the same harmonic guitar interval used on the guitar solo at the end of Hotel California. As soon as the duet ends, actually it doesn't end as much as the chorus, no longer able to contain its anger, interrupts this duet and jumps into the fight mode. Bach's music erupts violently in a visceral, vocal, orchestral maelstrom. The chorus calls upon all the forces of heaven, sin Blitzen, sin Donner, have thunder, have lightning, and all the forces of hell. They're calling them to destroy the betrayer Judas. They have definitely moved out of the freeze into "we are going to fight." The musical tempest that Bach creates is unlike anything ever written in the Baroque, and will really not be replicated again until late in Beethoven's career. The chorus's anger is so all-consuming that at one point they almost have to take a breath. There's a long, pregnant pause in the music, as if asking themselves, "Have I vented enough?" And then they come back, "No," and they come back even angrier. It's just one of the seminal moments in this entire music. So let's take a listen to this.
Haltet, kennt es nicht.
Sie führen ihn, sie flüstern ihn, ist
Sind Blitze, sind Donner, Wolken erschonnen, sind Blitze, sind Donner, Wolken erschonnen, sind Blitze, sind Donner, Blitze erschonnen, sind Blitze, sind Donner, Blitze erschonnen, sind Blitze, sind Donner, Wolken erschonnen, sind Blitze, sind Donner, Wolken erschonnen, sind Donner, Wolken erschonnen, sind Donner, Wolken erschonnen, sind Blitze, Donner, Blitze, Blitze, Donner, Blitze, sind Blitze, sind Donner, erschonnen.
In musical items number 34 and number 35, Bach brings an end to part 1 of the St. Matthew Passion. In 34, the chorus, having vented and calling down thunder and lightning and hoping the abyss of hell would swallow up the betrayer, their anger now moves to violence as one of the disciples draws a sword and cuts off the ear of the servant. In the telling in St. Matthew's Gospel, this disciple isn't identified. And notice how Bach scores this for the evangelist to sing an up and down melody here, almost connotating the cutting off of an ear. As the evangelist sings, then all the disciples abandoned him and fled. Also notice the melody. It moves slowly upward to a peak, and then it moves slowly back downward, almost creating a musical arch for the disciples to flee through. We've done the freeze, we've done the fight, and now it comes time for the disciples to do the flight. With number 35, Bach brings an end to this with a very succinct telling of the gospel message. Jesus' love for mankind, our great sinfulness, Jesus' sacrifice and shedding of blood for our sins, and our thankfulness for what he has done for us. All these themes that Bach has been intertwining throughout part 1 very succinctly come together. Like the opening of part 1, this last number uses all 3 choruses, both orchestras, so we have everybody. This chorale would have been familiar to Bach's listeners. However, here he has rearranged it into a more fugal polyphonic work with voices intertwining and moving out. The chorale was actually written in 1525 by Matthias Greitner. He was 1495 to 1552, and the text is by a librettist called Sebald Haydens. Note the strange juxtaposition of the disciples both abandoning Jesus yet proclaiming his gospel message. Bach has orchestrated this arrangement with rapidly moving couplets representing the disciples running for their lives, but It is interspersed with more sanguine interludes, as if they are momentarily hiding in dark alleyways or peeking around corners. Part 1 comes to an end with just the organ playing a very, very low E note on the pedal. This is the exact same note that Part 1 started with. This time, however, the note is all alone, like Jesus.
Und siehe, einer aus denen, die mit Jesu waren, reckte die Hand aus und schlug des hohen Priesters Knecht und hieb ihm ein Ohr ab. Da sprach Jesus zu ihm:
Stecke dein Schwert an seinen Ort, denn wer das Schwert nimmt, der soll durch Schwert umkommen. Oder meinest du, dass ich nicht könnte meinen Vater bitten, dass mir zuschickte mehr denn 12 Legion Engel? Wie würde aber die Schrift erfüllet? Es muss also gehen.
Zu der Stund sprach Jesus zu den Scharen:
Ihr seid ausgegangen als zu einem Mörder, mit Schwertern und mit Stangen mich zu fahren. Bin ich doch täglich bei euch gesessen und habe gelehrt im Tempel, und ihr habt mich nicht gegriffen. Aber das ist alles geschehen, das erfüllet würden die Schriften der Propheten.
Da verließen ihn alle Jünger und flohen.
So with that final deep E minor note, E minor chord actually, we end part one just as we started part one, back in the key of the cross. Just as a reminder, at this point in time, in Bach's time, they then would have had a 1 hour sermon. So we can all steel ourselves for Paul Walker's 1 hour sermon that's coming up on Good Friday. From here, we're going to move on to part two. We will move through the trial of Jesus, his flogging, and his eventual crucifixion. I will look forward to seeing you when we get to session number 4. Thanks a lot.